If you look into the research of the origins and creation of the state, just as an institution, right? This is an institution that's about 500 years old, the monopolistic bureaucratic state as we know of it today, which is something quite different from medieval systems of governance in Western Europe.
Mhm.
Uh, the old saying among scholars about the state is that the state made war and war made the state because military spending is so closely connected to overall state power. And this is, I mean, you noted from the Mises Institute, and two of our best scholars are Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, and they noted repeatedly that military spending is not only a driver of overall spending, of overall government regulation as well, but that it continually acts as a means of promoting more future spending as well, just on a propaganda level, right? We can always talk about threats from foreign powers and so on. And you can see that at work all of the time and how useful it is then in funneling more and more resources to the defense sector. Now, people who are in favor of this, they often bring up a red herring. They create a false dichotomy. They say either you're in favor of continual increases in military spending forever and ever till the end of time, or you're a pacifist. So if you don't support their latest desire for a huge, huge chunk of new spending, well, you must be in favor of just dismantling the Navy then, because they're never willing to engage with the question of what is the correct amount of spending. Part of that's because they don't know. They have no definition. They don't know what the correct amount of spending is, and they're constantly wanting to expand the theaters, especially Americans are constantly wanting to expand the theaters that they can get into. And the United States, right? There's never any disengagement from one part of the world to focus on another part, right? We'll just add another part of the world that we'll get involved with. And this is so different from something that we might support, which you might call armed neutrality, right? And throughout Europe, being a neutral nation has been a perfectly respectable thing to do. And you can also be armed and capable of defense at the same time. And of course, just the United States, John Mearsheimer said it best. The United States is the most secure country in the history of the world. It's got oceans on both sides of it. It has a huge navy, and it has thousands of nuclear warheads. You could have other researches that has come out on nuclear arms has shown that if you want to actually have capability to defer, or rather to deter military action against you in terms of an existential threat, the number of nuclear warheads you need actually probably numbers in the dozens, not in the thousands.
Right.
So most of these countries that have hundreds or thousands of warheads are spending so much more money than they could possibly need because no country is going to say, oh, you know what, let's just start a nuclear war with that country because they have half as many nuclear weapons as we have. You know, having half as many as 5,000, which is about what the U.S. and the Soviet or the Russians have, uh, those sorts of numbers are not necessary. All you have to do to have a complete disaster is burn up two or three or four or five cities using nuclear warheads. And this is like a global disaster, unbelievable in scale. So this idea that, oh, well, those guys have 1,000, so we better spend more money to modernize and update our nuclear arms is really just kind of absurd, crazy talk, but that's what defense agencies like to talk about because it gets a lot more military spending going. Whereas in the reality, if you're a country, you're France, you have a functioning navy, you have nuclear arms in a very moderate amount, no one's going to invade your country because this would bring extremely dangerous retribution, as well as simply you're not going to be invading them because defense spending, that is actual defense, requires much smaller amounts of spending than offensive military capability, where you're trying to occupy foreign countries, you're trying to sail to the other side of the world to attack other countries. That is ruinously expensive. What is not expensive is just having a navy that protects your own borders. But none of these distinctions are ever made. They just want more military spending in huge amounts, or you just think the world is a safe place and you don't care about any of that stuff at all. Those are the only two things the only two options that they think are acceptable. But the reality is that defense spending is not something you can get rid of because it is so baked into the governing coalitions of most states. Uh, the companies that make military arms, the military itself, right, is a huge employer in any sort of militarized economy. These aren't things you can just wipe away and get rid of. These things would be incredibly unpopular politically, and it also would cut off a lot of the system of military or of government patronage, government spending that helps bring support coming in to the regime in each case. Also helps to ensure that you can continue to centralize power as well. And it's useful for state building. And that's why all the scholars of the state history say that war built the state and the state waged wars. I mean, it's just so central to having strong states that can tax, can control, can regulate their own populations and engage in a lot of these extra activities as well. So that study, of course, is really bringing home empirically what has been the dominant theory for decades, really, about how the state functions and its relationship with war. So it's not exactly surprising to hear about that.
US militarism really stems from the Cold War mentality, in my opinion, right? Almost immediately after the World War II ended, the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States began. And so at that time, Washington justified, as you mentioned, military spending based on the Cold War logic that we need to have more nuclear warheads, we need to have more delivery systems to win this. Really, it nobody can win it, right? It's if it's a mutual, what is it, annihilation, right? Then it's not going to, there's not going to be a winner. And so the military industrial complex requires a monster to fight at all times. And that monster may be here domestically, and it could be a foreign quote unquote monster. So, do you think that that Cold War mentality in Washington changed since the end of the Cold War, or is it still sort of running the show?
No, it hasn't changed at all. And yes, the United States clearly became a different sort of country after 1945. You can see this a lot in the work of Jacob Hornberger, my colleague at the Future Freedom Foundation. He's done some great work on this, is how the U.S. changed after 1944. It became a national security state, is the terminology he uses. Prior to 1945, there was no CIA. The FBI was not involved in widespread surveillance like it is now, and actually billed itself as just a law enforcement assistance sort of organization, right? None of this national defense sort of stuff that it talks about nowadays. There was not the constant. Now, before then, there had, of course, been occasional interventions by the U.S. in, especially in Latin America, and to a much lesser extent in some other parts of the world farther afield. But these were far more intermittent. The amounts spent on it was much, much smaller. That changed after 1945 when it became a constant state of armament, of spending, of increasing spying power on both the domestic population and on foreigners as well. So that was a change. And then there was some talk that at the end of the Cold War, that might be scaled back, but that never happened. And that was actually quite an interesting time to be alive. I mean, I was a teenager back then, but I've paid attention to this stuff even back then. And I remember all the talk about, oh, we can finally significantly cut military spending because everything that the big government people were telling us was, well, as long as there's this Soviet threat, we're just going to have to keep spending money. And we have to forget about all this pro-freedom talk for the duration of the Cold War. But once we conquer the Soviets, then we can get back to being a very moderate, very humble Republican sort of government, and we can reclaim all that again. But that never happened. As soon as the Cold War ended, the United States immediately started talking about becoming a unipolar power, becoming a global hegemon, about making every other country in the world become a country that reflects American ideas of human rights. And that's how the United States, of course, became involved in Yugoslavia. And it was forcing an American vision of human rights on everybody else. And this was, of course, something the United States would have never gotten involved in the 19th century. But after 1945, anything goes. And whatever rationale you have to come up with to justify more military intervention, invading another country, it was used. And you could see that in Afghanistan and in Iraq, right? it's not enough to just say, oh, we need to invade these countries because it's good for national defense. They always pile on other reasons. Oh, we have to decapitate the regime and get rid of Saddam because Saddam gassed his own people
Hmm.
20 years ago. We have to get rid of the Afghani regime because they persecute women and they don't let women go to school, which, by the way, they're not doing, but they just announced the other day that women are no longer allowed to go to school in Afghanistan
Hmm.
or even really leave the house or participate in public life in any way. So I don't know how many Americans died in Afghanistan to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, but that's what happened. And women are right back where they were when we were being told that the United States needed to make war there for human rights reasons. And then, of course, there was the weapons of mass destruction reason. They're going to nuke us if
Hmm.
you let Saddam keep his weapons of mass destruction, which was vaguely defined. And then it turned out that was all nonsense. So they've always got plenty of extra reasons, and that's just what's been happening since 1991 or so when the Soviet Union shut down and went away. And they've just got new reasons to start wars every year, which are always with smaller countries that can't really fight back. The United States hasn't fought a peer country since 1945, but they managed to keep the whole scheme going. And what that means, fortunately, is that it keeps all the spending going as well. And I think that's really at the heart of what it is we don't really have to have a big, huge war with another country. We certainly don't want to fight a peer country because that could be disastrous and tens of thousands of Americans that could die in that. So we'll fight these little tiny third world countries that are dirt poor, and that you can spend immense amounts of money. And that was the comment that was made on why do these countries, they only need 50 nuclear warheads? Why do they have 10? Why do they have 100 of them? Why do they have 1,000 of them? People recognize it's because it's incredibly expensive. It requires lots of spending. So that's good. That's built in. That's not a flaw in the program. That's the whole point a lot of the time.